Yeah, we did want to spend
Mr. Ray.
We did want to spend a minute or two talking about the economic and fiscal impact statement and the cost analysis for the proposed Delta plans regulations. We talked about those at our last hearing, and several council members and other folks had some questions about them, and so I want to spend a brief amount of time talking about that, beginning by reminding us that this isn't a thorough benefit cost analysis. And that's because California's laws don't require that kind of analysis, partly because the expense involved and partly because of the difficulty of estimating economic benefits, including environmental benefits that are associated with the Delta plan. But the Delta plan will have real economic and fiscal benefits, a more reliable water supply that's less vulnerable to drought and other natural disasters, that's more resilient in the face of earthquakes and rising seas, that reduces reliance on the Delta by drawing more fully on all the available water supplies and by using water more efficiently. It's got tremendous economic benefits for the Central Valley's irrigated farm economy, to the urban economies that receive Delta water in the Bay Area and Southern California and the Central Coast, and to the 2 out of 3 Californians that depend on the Delta for their domestic water supply. A healthier Delta ecosystem is going to provide real economic benefits to coastal and inland commercial and recreational fisheries, to the outdoor recreation and tourism economy in the Delta, and to water users, whether they're in the Delta watershed or in the Delta itself or in the export areas, all of whom may find more flexibility and less stringent regulation of their use of water if the Delta ecosystem can be pulled back from the brink of breakdown. And certainly reducing risks to the Delta can minimize flood losses and flood fighting and disaster recovery costs and provide a more stable setting for investment in Delta communities and businesses. Protecting Delta farmland so that growers have a secure base of production can encourage diversification of the region's crop mix and investment in value-added crop processing and distribution systems. Another source of the economic and fiscal benefits of the plan comes from creating a more efficient system for making Delta decisions and for resolving conflicts among Delta stakeholders. These benefits can accrue from untangling regulatory gridlock, coordinating fund source, and emphasizing investments and actions that return the greatest benefits in terms of water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration. When we base decisions about those investments on science, we can reduce wasted spending on actions that don't work, and by using adaptive management, we can over time become more effective in managing our water supplies and restoring the ecosystem. And all these benefits can flow from implementation of the Delta plan, and we shouldn't forget about them when we talk about the cost of implementing the plan, because nothing's free, and we know that. In developing the Delta plan, you've embraced policies that are going to hold implementation costs down. First way you've done that is by making sure that the Delta plan doesn't regulate hardly any actions in areas that are planned for development in cities or in their spheres of influence or in the Delta's unincorporated towns. According to the Delta Protection Commission's Economic Sustainability Plan, these areas account for over 97% of the jobs in the Delta. And you've also structured the plan so that visitors serving recreational uses aren't regulated by the plan's policies. And of course, agriculture itself is exempt from the plan's regulatory program because it isn't a project under CEQA, which means that an additional 53% of the jobs in the primary zone are unaffected by the plan's regulatory program. So you put those two numbers together from the primary and secondary zones, and you can see that almost 99% of the employment in the Delta is unaffected by the plan's regulations. And similarly, it seems that virtually none of the housing that's constructed in the Delta will be affected by the plan's regulations. In the past decade, that would have included about 6,600 units that are built annually in areas that are planned for development of the secondary zone, and roughly 50 units that are built in the primary zone each year, mostly in the Delta's unincorporated communities. Another way you've held the costs of implementing the plan down is by relying on existing laws to provide most of the information and analysis that will be needed to comply with the plan's implementing regulations. For example, the environmental analysis that agencies are already undertaking to comply with CEQA can provide a lot of the information that's needed for many of the policies. Agricultural and urban water management plans that are already required can be used to demonstrate compliance with regulations to implement the plan's policies on reducing reliance on the Delta's water supplies. And because the gathering and analysis of this information or the preparation of these plans is already required by law, these costs aren't included in our estimate of the fiscal impact of the Delta plans and regulations. And that's right, because we're not imposing new costs to carry out the policies, but really we're making fuller use of work that's already occurring. But there are some costs associated with complying with the plan's regulatory policies, and we wanted to go through and talk about what those will be. The impact statement forecasts that the total annual cost that we can foresee for implementing the plan will be about $11.9 million to $16.8 million annually. And this sum is comprised of 4 different kinds of costs. The first is the cost of filing consistency certifications. The second is the cost of the adaptive management program. The third is the cost of evaluating whether it's feasible to set back levies. And then the final one is the cost of complying with the other substantive policies of the Delta plan. Well, first, let's look at the costs that are incurred by the Stewardship Council. Some of these costs are going to be incurred handling certificates of consistency that are filed by agencies that are approving projects in the Delta, or for handling occasional appeals. And our estimate is that the staff cost to handle these certificates of consistency and appeals will be about $438,000 annually. That's about 3% of the total cost of the plan's implementing rules. And we've estimated these costs based on a scenario about 25 consistency certifications filed annually, which we derive from looking at recent records of Delta projects for which CEQA documents have been filed with the state clearinghouse, but also recognizing that adoption of the plan may encourage progress on some activities like habitat restoration that have been on hold for a few years, and also that the economy as it recovers may result in a little higher level of activity than we've seen recently. The cost estimate is also based on a scenario in which about 30% of the approved projects are appealed, which would be about one every other month. And that experience is a little higher than established oversight agencies like the Coastal Commission experience, but we think that especially in the initial year or two of the plan, the appeal rate may be high as people test the certification process. Second, the Council and other state agencies will incur about $4.2 million in expenses to complete the prioritization of levee improvements in the Delta that the Delta Plan's regulations require. That will be done using existing bond funds that have already been appropriated by the legislature. It's a one-time cost that won't recur after the prioritization is complete. And that accounts for about 25% of the costs that the economic and fiscal impacts statement attributes to the Delta Plan's implementing regulations. Now let's look at costs that other state or local agencies will incur to comply with the rules. Our estimate is that this will total about $8.6 million to $12.3 million, which is about 73% of the total annual costs of complying with the plan's rules. And these costs by other state or local agencies have 3 components. And the first one we want to consider is the cost of certifying that approved projects are consistent with the plan. Now, we estimate that in total, state or local agencies, other than the Stewardship Council, will expend somewhere between $240,000 and about $336,000 annually on processing certifications of consistency. That's only about 2% of the total cost of complying with the plan's implementing rules. And again, we expect that many, if not most, of the 25 projects for which consistency certifications are filed annually, they're not going to result in the approving agency incurring a lot of additional costs. And if I can get the first my slides up, I know I can do it. Where do I point this? There we go. Whoops. Oh, my.
You're going back.
Yeah.
There you go.
Most of the covered actions that are certified and handled, we think are going to be relatively low-cost activities because, again, folks are relying on existing information, and really it's just a matter of filing the certification forms, which, again, we think is going to cost about maybe somewhere between $4,200 and $16,000 per certification, depending on the complexity of the project. And if a project's appealed, then we estimate the cost to the approving agency for compiling the administrative record and transmitting to us might be about $1,200 to $3,900 for each appeal. You know, the second cost that other state or local agencies will incur is the cost of adaptive management. for the water management or ecosystem restoration actions where that's required. And we estimate that cost will be about $2.9 to $4 million annually, or about a quarter of the total annual cost of complying with the implementing rules. Now, adaptive management isn't going to be required of all 25 or so certifications filed each year, but only for the water management or ecosystem restoration actions. So it's not a cost that would be imposed on land use activities or other kind of actions that aren't involving water management or ecosystem restoration. We think that describing the adaptive management program in the certification document may add between like $420 to $5,600 per certification, again, depending on how complex the program and the project are. And if we look at recent experience carrying out the adaptive management program that our rules would require, it might cost about 4% of a project's total cost, which would be spread over the 5 to 15 years of the adaptive management's program life. You know, for a lot of projects, adaptive management programs may already be required by existing regulations for permits from the Water Board, the Corps of Engineers, or some other regulator. But there will be some cases where it's the Council's regulations that are the first to require the use of adaptive management. You know, the third kind of costs are the additional costs that the Delta Plan policies will impose on the planning or construction of a project. And our analysis indicates that in total, those may total about $7.2 to $12.1 million for the cost we can see. That's the annual cost. That's about 40% of the total annual cost of complying with the plan's implementing rules. But it's, we get to concede that this may not anticipate all the costs that might accrue due to changes that would be required in a project to carry out the plan's implementing rules, because we don't have a clear forecast of exactly what projects will be coming down the line in the next few years or how they might need to change. It's difficult to estimate that impact. But we are able to identify some of these costs, and the largest of them that we can foresee is the cost of assessing whether a levee can be feasibly be set back as required by the Ecosystem Restoration Policy number 4, and which requires that levees assess whether it is feasible to be set back. Of course, there's some real benefits with setting back levees. You get safety benefits where a setback increases a channel's capacity to contain floodwaters, or puts it on a sounder foundation, or helps reduce erosion. And then there's substantial environmental benefits from improved riverside habitat for fish and wildlife. But assessing whether it's feasible to set a levee back, that's not a trivial exercise and not inexpensive. Based on experience in Sacramento, looking at SAFCA's costs of evaluating the feasibility of setting back levees in Natomas, we estimate that conducting such a study could increase planning costs about 20%. Again, based on the Natomas example, and up there those are large urban levees that are meet or exceed the Corps of Engineers project levee standards, this additional cost for feasibility studies, say for 1 or 2 levees annually in the Delta, could total between $3 or $7 million. And that is about 45% of the total annual costs that we forecast for implementing the Delta Plan's rules in the first couple of years. You know, for smaller non-project levees in the Delta, these costs would likely be smaller. In the case of non-project levies that a typical Delta RD would be responsible for, these costs would be eligible for reimbursement from DWR's Delta Levies Special Projects Program, so they're really costs that will be borne by the state levies program, rather than primarily by local RDs. And because additional funds are going to be available for setback levies, you can think of these costs as of evaluating whether a levee can, you can think of this as the cost of evaluating whether a levee project can tap into extra funds that would otherwise wouldn't be available for it. You know, for example, the BDCP calls for setting back 20 miles of levee. So a study that shows it's actually feasible to set back your levee may make it possible for you to tap into a fund source that you wouldn't otherwise have available to construct levee improvements that you really need. So when we estimated this cost of $3 to $7 million annually as a proportion of the roughly $2 billion that agencies forecast may be needed to upgrade, to improve Delta levees in complying with current priorities. You know, the additional costs of complying with other Delta Plan policies, they're much less expensive, assuming a diverse array of different kinds of projects that might need to comply with Delta Plan policies. We estimated these costs at about $238,000 to $336,000 annually, or again about 2% of the total costs of complying with the Delta Plan's implementing rules. The costs added to any one project are likely to be small. Just examples, an agency documenting that it's carrying out its urban or ag water management plan, we think that would add about $1,400 to a certification. The additional cost to the sponsor of an ecosystem restoration or water management project that the Delta plan might force them to incur by insisting they consult with local governments and landowners to avoid potential land use conflicts might be about $8,400. The cost of evaluating whether encroachments into floodplains or floodways are having adverse effects, we think that engineering cost would be about $1,400 per encroachment. So in total, again, the Delta Plan's rules might cost about $11.9 to $16.8 million in the first few years. And you can see in the pie chart how these costs are allocated. 28% of those are costs of the stewardship councils, with 3% being the cost of processing certifications and appeals, and 25% being the cost of completing studies to update state priorities for levy investment. 2% is the cost that state or local governments will incur to file certifications. 24% is the cost of adaptive management. 45% is the cost of evaluating whether the levies can be set back, and the remaining 2% is the cost of complying with other policies. Steve Hatchett, our consultant from CH, who helped put together the fiscal analysis, is here, and maybe between the two of us we can answer any questions if you have them.
Okay, Mr. Natoli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I recognize this is a hearing to receive comments from members of the audience, but I want to get a bit of clarification, and thank you, Dan, for taking some time to walk through that. And you try to boil it down to a chart. It doesn't do justice, I think, to the explanation, and it's better than trying to get through the text of the entirety of the analysis. But I guess I want to ask you, Dan, that first, at the last DSC council meeting, we had a member of the public who spoke to some of the added costs. I think your testimony or your points here today went to try to address some of those, but where, and I know that the executive director certainly picked up on it as well, that talked about costs maybe being either triple or quadruple on some projects as it relates to both the analysis and other requirements that might come into play. And I don't know if what you laid out was an attempt to try to break that down without specifically directing to those comments. But 20% is still significant, even if that's the real number on an average basis. And so let me ask you, I guess the first part of the question is was what you laid out an attempt to try to break that down and respond at least in part to that? Or
yeah, frankly, I did not understand the basis of the assertion that costs would increase as dramatically as had been proposed.
Yeah.
If I recall, that was a comment made by an engineer for a local levy district, perhaps looking at the costs that were included in the fiscal and economic impact statement for the costs of evaluating the feasibility of setting back levies in the Natoma, and that was based on Natoma. So I think, part of that is he's maybe looking at his costs for a rural RD, and he says, it only costs me this much a mile, and you're saying it's going to cost me now this much a mile, that's 4 times what I spend. But what we're really saying is, hey, we think it'll cost 20% more, and we estimated how much more that would be by using the Natomas example. If we'd pulled estimates out of a rural RD, it might have been a lower number. I think when we look at setback levies, that is an expense. That shows that's one of the reasons that, one of your recommendations in the plan is that the Department of Resources act quickly to identify criteria for setting back levies. We know that we want to set back levies where channels are undersized, maybe where we've got, they can't convey the flood flow, maybe where we've got foundation problems, seepage or whatever. And also the BDCP is, I presume, going to identify those places that are the highest priority for setting back levies. So when we get that advice from DWR, I think one thing we can do is go back and look at this policy and maybe provide, sharpen its focus on those areas where we have the best potential for levy setbacks. But it does cost money to look at this stuff. I wouldn't try to hide that. I think the advantage if you are a local RD in the Delta is that those costs would be reimbursed, as I understand it, through the special projects element of the DWR's Delta Levies program. So it's not like it's going to come out of a local RD's hide. Now for the urban levy programs, yeah, there are expenses, but again, that's a most of the $2 billion in total levy costs that our analysis forecasts for the Delta is the cost of urban levies in the Pocket, in West Sacramento, in the San Joaquin County communities. And so, those are expensive programs and probably places where it's going to be easier to show that levies can't be set back because you don't have any room to set them back. They're right in the middle of town. You don't have, space to move them.
But, thanks, Dan. Just a couple of follow-ons. And so kind of going back to your response that for those, say, the either non-project and or local RD levies, and I think you said total added cost would be anywhere from $3 to $7 million annually, and obviously be eligible through special projects, I guess, and the ongoing subventions would supposedly fund maintenance projects. But those historically haven't been large pools of money. I think the subventions have been about $10 million annually, and special projects have, depending upon bond proceeds and other prioritization within the department and agencies that fund that. I mean, $3 to $7 million can be a pretty big chunk of anything annually. It may be reimbursable, but what it potentially does is just makes the backlog that much greater. Not to argue against necessarily the policy, but I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there may be a greater emphasis going forward on special projects and subventions, but $3 to $7 million annually taken from that, or does that 3 to 7 include all the project as well?
That would include project and
okay. So
but the assumption here is that we're evaluating each year. We're looking at studies to assess the feasibility of setting back 1 or 2 levies a year. That's probably really maybe a little higher than the pace at which significant levy improvements have happened over the last couple of years. But Sherman Island levy was set back not that long ago. There may be other proposals in the near-term future to do things in other parts of the Delta. So it doesn't seem like an unreasonable estimate to me. It might be a little higher than we've had in the recent past.
Okay. Maybe just for today's purposes, again, we can certainly come back to this, but would it be possible, again, I appreciate trying to address, again, some comments received, and we will do those formally, obviously, through the rulemaking process, but I guess for the party who put forth those costs, maybe our staff, you or somebody, could meet with them and their representatives and try to boil that down. Because I would, before we, are called upon to take some final actions on this, at least to be pretty clear beyond, I think, some of the general estimates and projections that are made in the analysis, and I think the clarifications that you've provided in your summation today, I would like to have a little better understanding. Again, and maybe very well what you just said, using a different standard than what would be applied potentially in another geographical area of the Delta or in a different levy setting. But it would be helpful to know that, because those were pretty stark contrasts, and I'm still not certain here today whether that gap's been narrowed or not. And I appreciate your explanation, though. It's helped a bit on this.
It certainly highlights the importance of that policy in terms of the fiscal impact of the regulatory program. And we want to make sure we're not doing something that's unnecessary, because those are large costs. I mean, the benefits of setting back a levy, if you can do it in the right spot, are so substantial that's the reason additional funds are available for those kinds of projects. But we want to make sure we're just not making people go through paperwork studies for no purpose. I got that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Any other questions of Mr. Ray or Mr. Coolidge?